How do you fight monopoly power? Senator Amy Klobuchar will be here to talk about her new book, Antitrust. Did Alexander Graham Bell advance the cause of the deaf? Andrew Solomon will join us to discuss Katie Booth's The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power, and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness. Elizabeth Harris will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's April 30th. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now is Senator Amy Klobuchar from Washington. She is the senior senator from Minnesota, and her new book is called Antitrust: Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. Senator, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. It's just wonderful to be on.
You have been doing a few things during the past few years, been busy. Why add a book? And I might add, this is not a quickie book. This is not an election book. This is a very heavily reported historical book, more than 200 pages of notes. Why?
Well, because I care that much about this. I started to think about doing this a few years ago, and it really, for me, started with a call I got way back in 2008 when I got a call from a pharmacist actually at Minneapolis Children's Hospital. And he said that the cost of this life-saving baby heart drug for heart defects had gone up astronomically from like $80 some a treatment to $1,600 a treatment. And he didn't know why. And so this is a very typical, you get these constituent calls. So our staff followed up with the head of Minneapolis Children's, and lo and behold, it turned out that one company had bought that drug, but then they had also cornered the market by buying the competitor drug. And so what happened was that the FTC got involved after I brought it up. It's like your classic new senator, and I bring it up. I have the little vial at a hearing, and I say, why is this happening to the FTC? And they start Federal Trade Commission. They start looking into it and end up bringing a major suit. And that was really exciting, except then, which is typical of a lot of these cases, the courts threw it out basically and said, oh, no, they're similar. And then it took years for a generic and another competitor to develop. And so literally, I thought if a U.S. senator, the entire Federal Trade Commission, and a bunch of angry doctors and nurses and parents of newborn babies can't fix a monopoly problem that's so obviously price gouging, then we better do something about it. And that kind of launched my interest in this from the Senate standpoint. And I ended up as the chair or ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee for the last years. And it also made me realize how little was going on legislatively. So I thought, okay, in the past, people wrote these books and started movements, and it better not be a thin book because it's a big topic. And so that's what motivated me to do it.
All right. I want to get more into why we have such trouble regulating monopolies, doing something about it. But let's start at a really basic level. Our culture is obviously maybe relentlessly, perhaps religiously capitalist. One of our most popular games, and you point out you played it as a child and loved it, is, of course, Monopoly. So let's start with a really basic question. What's wrong with monopolies?
Well, what's wrong is that we are a capitalistic economy, and that means competition. And that means that prices go down and people get jobs because there's competition. And so if you have one company controlling things, I guess one great example that's easy to understand is the old AT&T. So AT&T owned all the equipment under it. That's called a vertical monopoly. And it also owned all that phone service, local, long distance, you name it. That's sort of a horizontal monopoly. And so what happened was competitors wanted to get in the market and bring the prices down. And AT&T had so much power that it was impossible to do, as well as how the laws were set up. And so finally, the government, under Democratic and Republican presidents, actually started suing, and legislation developed, and that monopoly broke up. The long distance prices went way down. Then that really set off to create a lot of competition and new products. So monopolies are bad because they control basically everything. They control the means of commerce. They control wages. It's really bad for employees if you have a special skill and you only have one company you can go work at. And they also make it harder for small businesses, innovations, because if you're a monopoly, you might have prices low for a while when there's a few other competitors, and you have no incentive to do that. And if you're like, say, an ag monopoly, why would you have an incentive to develop a whole bunch of less expensive seeds or something like that when you're the only kid on the block or the only bully on the block, is the case of some of the tech companies. So that's the problem with monopolies.
So people who are in business or maybe a small business owner can easily understand this, or as a consumer, when it comes to pricing and price gouging, they can understand the destructive consequences of monopolies. But you also talk in your book about monopolies as a threat to mobility, as exacerbating income disparities, and even as a threat to democracy. Can you sort of draw some of those lines for us?
Sure. And I don't think people think about this. They think about sort of companies battling it out. But when you have a monopoly controlling things, and you think about, maybe easy to think about the old days, and my grandpa was an iron ore miner. When you have monopolies controlling things, it's really hard for workers, just for the reason I mentioned. They don't have other places to go work, and monopolies set the wages. And back in history, that's why the union movement developed in part. They were taking on the robber barons of their time, whether it was the Pullman Company, whether it was the rail monopolies or the steel monopoly. Then you also have inequality because, of course, the monopolies get really rich and the companies get really big. We right now have some of the biggest companies the world has ever known, the country has ever known, with some of the tech companies. And then if you're a small business, do okay, you get started. And a lot of times they do buy you out. Look at WhatsApp and Instagram. But in the end, on your own, it's really hard to compete when they own everything. Then you asked about democracy, and that's probably the biggest way to connect the dots to what's going on right now in our politics. Let's start with freedom of the press, since I'm talking to you. The newspapers, of course, have been dwindling away, especially on the local basis across the country. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that it's expensive to produce content. And not everyone is the New York Times or the Washington Post. And it is hard for them if they don't get paid for their content. And it's really hard for a little newspaper, in St. Paul, Minnesota, or Duluth, Minnesota, or Lanesboro, Minnesota, to negotiate with Google and Facebook about how much they're supposed to be charged for their content. And you saw a great example of a monopoly with what just happened in Australia, where they basically were trying to charge for content, and Facebook and Google said, okay, we're going to leave. We're just going to leave you with no search engine, Google says, because we're 90% of the market. That's bad for democracy when you have dwindling news organizations. Another thing that's bad for democracy, as Exhibit A being the insurrection, is misinformation. That is really bad because, as we see with the vaccines, where one person told me their mother-in-law thought that a microchip was going to be planted in her arm from the vaccine because she'd read it on the internet. And then the third thing is you have huge privacy violations because you don't have control over your own data because they're controlling it. So those are just some examples, but it divides people when they don't have a shared set of common facts.
I want to go back in history. You mentioned your family worked in the mining industry back during the Gilded Age. When we think about the old monopolies and trusts, we think about railroads and meat packing and oil and whiskey and tobacco. Now it's technology, it's pharmaceuticals. Does the nature of the industry change the impact and the power, or is it really about the law?
Well, I think it's so interesting that there's similarities to the past, but this is even more sophisticated than that. Back then, they just would all say, well, it's hurting us to compete with each other. So let's all form this trust. So maybe, no one will notice legally. But of course, finally, Teddy Roosevelt and others did. And then they got sued. And finally, after years, these trusts started to be broken up. Well, what you have now is you have companies that started buying out their competitors. And the best example of that is the email that Mark Zuckerberg sent himself, where he's talking about some of the smaller competitors. And he says these businesses are nascent, but the networks established The brands are already meaningful. And if they grow to a large scale, they could be very disruptive to us. That's they're not buying necessarily to get their bells and whistles. They're buying them because they don't want them to grow to be their competitor. And he later said in another email discovered during my friend David Cicilline's house hearings, it is better to buy than compete. And who would know? Maybe WhatsApp or Instagram could develop bells and whistles that would help with misinformation or privacy. We're never going to know because they're bought up.
I mean, it's so brazen now, and I want to, as exhibited in those emails, I want to get to how we got there. Was the last time really significant antitrust legislation passed in this country the Sherman Act of 1890 and the Clayton Act of 1914? And if so, what happened?
Well, pretty much so. There have been changes and exemptions made for, everything from ag co-ops on. And there was a Hart-Scott-Rodino bill about filings and how you had to file things, and a few other bills that came along involving retail and other things. But what happened was that these major interests basically have gotten their way. And what most significantly happened was this Robert Bork theory of antitrust about the consumer welfare standard, where he basically looked at this in a really, in my mind, warped way, which was to say, okay, this is just about basically efficiency. And he would even look at people that could be harmed as the big corporations themselves. That started going through the courts, that kind of theories, as conservative judges were appointed during Reagan and Bush, and they just adopted this basically as their mantra. There was obviously another viewpoint that was shared by Stephen Breyer and others who once taught antitrust. But the point is that they started to dominate the thought. And right now on that Supreme Court, you've got people like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, who at the circuit court level took this to an extreme, adding to what was already a very conservative court. And so that makes it hard to bring the cases. They've basically taken the laws, which were used pretty effectively for quite a while, and then have basically squashed them down with limiting court rulings. And then you have the Congress. And one of the great examples of monopolies is they buy out everything. They hire all these lobbyists. Everyone has, one of them that they know. And I was on Stephen Colbert the other night, and he got that, and he was joking. And on the air, he goes, I love Google. I love Google so much, because people don't want to take them on. They don't want to be like demoted in their search engine, right?
Right,
So he was
right.
kidding about this, but that's what happens. And so they have so much control, especially these new monopolies. And I just had this happen at our App Store hearing. Senator Lee and I did it together. And we had a few companies that came forward, namely Match.com and Tile, as well as Spotify, and just told these horror stories about getting threatened the night before the hearing, about paying 30% to Apple or Google. And yet I know of many other companies, and I won't say their names on this interview because I said I wouldn't, who have come to us, but they're afraid to come forward because they think that they will be hurt. And so that is all what happens with monopoly. And so some of this cries out for changes in the law, but it also cries out for very aggressive enforcement from the FTC and the Department of Justice.
And let's go back to Robert Bork for a moment. So his principal rule was harm to consumers. And I will just name one company because it's an obvious one, but Amazon, right? So the argument there you're saying would be, look, prices are lower for consumers, delivery is faster, access to products is greater. And so by Robert Bork's estimation, then it cannot be a monopoly or a harmful monopoly because it is helping consumers and not harming consumers. How do you argue against that?
Well, you go back to the original intent. You love this. I'm going the opposite, right? Of these laws. And these laws were not meant to protect big companies, and they weren't meant to necessarily punish success, right? Success is a good thing. But what they were meant to do is saying at some point, you might have a company, say AT&T, that gave you all kind of good things for a while, Ma Bell, but that at some point they become such a monopoly. And back in the old days, they were using percentages of how much of a market you had or things like that until these new theories came in. And they would basically say, yeah, there have been some benefits of this in the past, but basically we know from economic theory, from Adam Smith himself, who warned of the overgrown army of monopolies, that this is not in the end going to lead to good stuff. because so many people are using just one platform instead of others. And so that's why I think the best way to do this right now is to have our laws be as sophisticated as the companies that we're dealing with. And that means looking at making it easier to prove up these cases by switching the burden for the big mergers or for the big exclusionary conducts of the companies that are the largest, and say, instead of the government having to prove that it hurts competition, you guys have to prove that it doesn't hurt competition. Instead of just simply saying, we're just going to look at whether we approve mergers or not, you've got to look backwards, just like they did with AT&T or some of the big cases, Standard Oil. They looked backwards and said, wait a minute, this has gotten out of hand. And it doesn't mean that we're going to make this company go away. The chairman of AT&T after the breakup said they got stronger because they had to compete. It just means you may have to not engage in certain kinds of conduct, like perhaps self-preferencing your own products on a search engine, or in the case of the app stores, maybe you'll have to let people on your stores say, hey, you can get a better deal on our website. There's all kinds of things you could do, either by rule, regulation, as a result of lawsuits, which was the AT&T breakup. But to make it go smoother, I think two things have to happen. One, we've got to put the resources into those agencies. They are a shadow of their former self, even during the Reagan administration, and they can't take on the world's biggest companies with Band-Aid and duct tapes. That's why Senator Grassley and I have a bill to give them more money by changing the way the fees are structured. And then secondly, change some of our laws as we have in the past. And you're right, it's been quite a dormant period for action with antitrust, but over time, we have changed our laws to meet the time, except for the last decades. We've done nothing.
So you have 25 points in your book, an action plan, and I will leave it to listeners to read all 25 in the book.
Oh, yes. You don't want me to rattle off all 25 right now?
But just to give a kind of sense of where the priority should lie specifically, is it that the laws that are on the books are outdated? Is it that they've been defanged by the courts, or that they're not enforced due to lack of funding or lack of will?
All of the above. There is a lack of funding, and it makes it really hard for these agencies to decide which thing. And now that they are finally taking on, actually during the end of the Trump administration, I think it's good that these cases have bridged Democratic and Republican administrations. But once they're doing those big cases, how are they going to do the other one? When we have consolidation in everything from cat foods to caskets, online travel, over 90% is controlled by just two companies. You think you're getting deals. Those companies are owned by two companies. And so I think getting them the resources, updating the laws, which has to happen. And I give a bunch of ideas for what Congress can do, some of which I have bipartisan support. And then the third thing is what a president can do. And that's doing things like appointments. And Lena Khan's recent nomination for the Federal Trade Commission is a great example of an out-of-the-box thinker, looking at what we call the horizontal and vertical merger guidelines. And then finally, there are things outside of antitrust that we can do. And that's things like getting rid of some of these non-compete agreements that make it harder for workers, immigration reform to allow for more competition, encouraging women and minority-owned businesses. New businesses get really hurt when there's a monopoly in place. And then finally, individual citizens, which is why I wrote this book and put in over 100 cartoons, because I wanted to make a very hard topic that took me years to understand somewhat relatable for people. And that means asking your elected official what they're doing. Why can't we pass anything? It means, of course, supporting local small businesses. And so there's just all kinds of things we can do, hearkening back to the days of the farmers with their pitchforks and the union marches in Chicago to really create a grassroots movement.
I want to talk about popular sentiment, popular culture just for one moment. You mentioned, putting cartoons in and the idea of getting a groundswell of public support. While there is, of course, that monopoly playing, meaning Monopoly, the game playing aspect to our culture, it does seem that in recent years, there's a growing tide. Phrases like big pharma and big tech, you can say that most people know what one means when we use phrases like that. Do you think that there is a growing desire on the part of the American public for something to be done?
I do. And I always think of this woman I met in a diner in Albert Lee, Minnesota, and she was there with her husband and brother-in-law. And she said, "Oh, I saw you on TV." And I said, "Oh, was it about Russia and the election issues?" And she said, "No, it was about," she kind of stopped for a while and she says, "big, about things being too big." Because that's really hard for us on our farm. And, I think that there is a growing interest in this. It's just that it is why I wrote the book is it's just so hard for people to get their arms around it and even having any kind of discussion about what the best way to go. We've gone from antitrust campaign presidential songs back in the progressive era to it's just sort of ending up as legal battles in the courtroom. So what I've tried to do here is make it so we can have a starting discussion about why this is happening. But I think there are examples of this all the time. Robert Reich did a incredible video on this going through a grocery store. John Oliver did a half an hour segment in which he ended saying, if all of this consolidation and monopolization is enough to make you want to die, good luck. And then if the screen flashes up, because there's only 3 casket makers left in the country. And I point out that one bought the other, so now there's only 2.
So we need more comedy TV. That's not my department, but this is a book review podcast. I want to ask you 2 other final book-related questions, but not about this book. The first question is, of course, this is your 3rd book. Your last book prior to this was a campaign book. But your first book, I want to talk about for a moment because I read it back in the day. It's called Uncovering the Dome, and it looked at the battle over the construction of a new sports stadium between the Twin Cities. I actually TA'd this book for a class in city politics in college, so I have to ask about it. This was your thesis, right?
Yes, it was my senior thesis at Yale. And I was a longtime Vikings fan, actually. And there was this huge battle for decades about where to build a new stadium, to the point where there was a proposal to build it between Minneapolis and St. Paul with the touchdowns, on either side. There was a proposal for an inflatable dome that would move around. And so I told the story. I was inspired actually as a college kid. This is quite hilarious, by Graham Allison's Cuban Missile Crisis book. How that got to a dome stadium, only a college student could explain. But he analyzed things in terms of, first of all, the bigger macro story, which in this case is professional sports and cities. And that was the beginning, the first quarter of the book. And then he looked at interests. And then he finally looked at the individuals and how they made decisions. And so I structured the book in the same way and took this example, having some great professors for political science, as I know you did, and wrote the book. And I literally worked through every break, Thanksgiving and spring break when everyone else was gone. I was at the computer lab that they had back then, learning the function keys so I could type it up. And it became a book and was published for quite a while and used in college classes, as you know.
That trained you up for this book writing experience. Okay, last question, which is something I have not yet heard, even though I tend to run with sort of literary types. Your husband proposed to you in a bookstore?
Yes, exactly. And it had a very cool name back then. It was called the Hungry Mind bookstore, and it was next to a restaurant that we ate at that night called the Table of Contents.
Oh,
And then later they got in trouble for the name because I think it was some kind of, as usual, legal violation of some other name. So then they changed it to the Ruminator bookstore. But
not
in
as
any
good.
case, he wanted to go for a walk to propose to me, I guess. But I said it was too cold. So he did the next best thing and found the nonfiction aisle. And by the way, did it on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th, because he's a huge Lincoln fan. So
Well,
there you go.
as accidental proposal places go, I think he did pretty well.
Yeah, I did well. He was incredible. So he's written a bunch of books himself on the death penalty. So.
All right. Well, hungry minds can read this book next. The book, again, is called Antitrust, Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. It's by Senator Amy Klobuchar. Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Pamela. It was great to be on.
Joining us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review, my colleague Tina Jordan. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I have something fun, I think, which is a piece from 1978 called My Summer. And it's a piece we actually ran fairly regularly over the decades. We contacted dozens of writers usually and asked them what they were up to for the summer. And I'm just going to read you a few of the responses from 1978 that I especially love. John Cheever says, I'd like to remain here in Ossining for the summer and work on a bulky piece of fiction. I will, of course, swim and weed the vegetables, but I cannot possibly stretch this to 100 words. Cynthia Ozick sent a poem to us, and she said, I'll sit here in my hovel, and by, beginning in July, I'll write my little novel. This is a public warning. Keep out, night and morning. Don't come, don't call. No one is welcome, no one at all, until I get to the end. Find another enemy, acquaintance, or friend. And if you expect me to read, or sign, or take note, or go, or in any way serve the world's woe, remember that I'm a summer curmudgeon, perfectly willing to employ a bludgeon. So keep away, don't call. No one is welcome, no one at all. It's very hard to top that, but I'm going to try.
Okay.
I have two more quick ones. John Kenneth Galbraith said, when this request, like April to England or the red, red robin, comes bobbing along from the book review editor, I know what is expected of me. It's not time for originality. I must tell him that come July, I will escape, one always escapes, the grime and pornography of the city and the ghastly pressures of the literary, or anyhow writing. I will settle myself in the sylvan near distance under a tree by the lake, 1 foot dangling in among the tadpoles and frogs. I will relax, restore the deep tissues, and read the deep books that duty have forced me to forgo all the previous winter, spring, and fall. And I'm actually going to finish with Fran Lebowitz because this one made me laugh out loud, which won't surprise you. She said, aside from trying to gracefully accept the fact that, once again, my parents are refusing to send me to summer camp, I plan to move to a larger and less interesting apartment. In preparation for this move, I'm presently engaged in compiling a list of my worldly goods in order that Sotheby's might begin work on the catalog for the auction of the Frances Ann Leibovitz collection. As soon as the catalog is complete and the move has been made, I plan on devoting myself to avoiding cultures different from our own and getting to the bottom of virgin acrylic. So there you have it, a sampling of what writers were up to in the summer of 1978.
Wow. When did this tradition start and when did it end?
It seems to have started, as far as I can tell, in the 1940s. There was a really interesting one in the summer of 68 in which we went to writers. Obviously, that was a very politically volatile time, and said, how is what you're going to be doing and working on this summer reflecting what's going on in the country around us? And that should probably be a half-hour segment on the podcast. It's completely fascinating. I think I last saw one of these sometime in the 90s.
Well, perhaps a revival. Tina, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Andrew Solomon joins us now. He is the author of several books, including The Noonday Demon and Far from the Tree, as well as the forthcoming book, Who Rocks the Cradle? This week, he joins us to talk about a book he reviewed for us, Katie Booth's The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power, and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness. Andrew, welcome back to the podcast.
What a pleasure to be here, Pamela. Thank you so much.
Let's start with the subject of this book, at least the biographical subject, Alexander Graham Bell. Most people probably associate him with the invention of the telephone, now basically a computer. But talk a little bit about his work with the deaf.
His great passion in life was reforming deaf education. He had a deaf mother. He later on had a deaf wife. And he believed that it was possible to teach deaf people to use oral speech and lip reading, and therefore to be fully integrated into the mainstream of society. He developed over the years techniques for teaching the deaf and really developed the telephone almost by accident as part of his work on the deaf. The deaf were his focus and his obsession. And he drove the movement toward what is called oralism, the use of speech, as opposed to manualism, the use of sign language, which in fact turned out to be a tragedy for many people in the deaf community, for the deaf community at large.
Well, let's start with his mother and his wife. How did that inform his own attitude towards deafness?
His mother was someone who was deaf but used spoken language. She had not been fully deaf from birth. And then he was involved in instructing deaf people and trying to teach them to speak using a very complicated system devised originally by his father. And one of his students was a high-born and compelling woman named Mabel, and he fell in love with his student, as professors did in that era before everything shifted and changed in our politics of teaching, and he courted her quite
When it
aggressively.
became not okay to seduce one's students, is what you're saying in a gentle manner.
So he seduced his student, and they had a long and in most ways actually quite a good marriage, but she was someone who had been deafened when she was, I think it was 3 years old, and she had already begun to acquire oral speech. And so her ability to then sustain something that had already begun for her is very different from the situation of people who were born without any hearing at all.
So it sounds as if, at least judging from that personal experience, that would incline Alexander Graham Bell to believe in the possibility of oralism. How real is that possibility, and how easy is it for people who are deaf from birth, perhaps, to acquire oral speech?
Well, in that time, and of course things have changed dramatically since the invention of the cochlear implant and modern medical responses to deafness, but at that time, if you had no ability to hear, it was possible to train people over a long period of time to make many of the sounds that were involved in speech. Some people had a natural gift for that, and they just got the hang of it, and they ended up being able to speak. But most people ended up with incomprehensible speech. And the problems were two. One, that you have a window for language acquisition that's built into your brain. And if you don't acquire some kind of language by the time you reach the age of, say, 10 or 12, it's very difficult ever to acquire any kind of language. And without language, it's impossible to achieve full-scale thought. So, in effect, the people who didn't acquire oral speech were stuck in an avoidable form of intellectual disability of one kind or another. And the other problem is that learning to speak is unbelievably time-consuming if you are a deaf person. And so often these children were being taught phonemes and pronunciation and all of these other things, did not in the meanwhile learn mathematics or history or philosophy or literature or any of the other things they might have learned, and they therefore ended up with an avoidable lack of education.
There was one other woman who was very pivotal in Alexander Graham Bell's approach to deafness and oralism, and that was Helen Keller. Can you talk about how he met Keller and what his relationship with her was, and her own position on oralism versus manualism?
Well, Helen Keller was taught by Annie Sullivan, and they came to Bell as the most prominent educator for the deaf. Helen Keller continued to communicate largely through Annie Sullivan, but Graham Bell, who was a very accomplished linguist in these difficult and sometimes obscure forms of language, did work with her and did learn to use her communication system, which was somewhat nonverbal. He really worked with her in the earlier part of her life when she thought of herself as grossly disabled. And she said in her first autobiography, which she dedicated to him, that for her to marry someone would be like that person marrying a statue. She thought that she was not fully acceptable or could not be fully integrated in the world of ordinary people. Later in life, she rather recanted on that position and retracted it. But for all that we admire Helen Keller and for all that she was a huge celebrity in her day, she saw herself as very limited and very disabled, and not as someone who was remarkable in the way we now think of her. And Graham Bell, though he, I think, was very attached to her and in some ways very admiring of her, echoed that point of view.
What did he think about sign language?
He thought that sign language was a secondary, second-rate thing. He didn't recognize the integrity of it as a language. He learned it very fluently and could use it very well, but he didn't find any beauty in it, and he didn't really recognize it as another language of equal validity. I mean, his underlying belief was that if you could be someone who passed for hearing, you were doing well. And that was what he was trying to teach people. And of course, the deaf politics movement, which had already begun in his day, though it had not reached the strength it's reached now, said that actually, while it was nice to be able to interact with people who were hearing and convenient and helpful, that there actually was a great beauty in sign. George Viditz, who was the leader of the deaf community in many ways at that point, talked about the sign language that was God's greatest gift to the deaf. And for Graham Bell, that was stuff and nonsense.
And for Graham Bell, was this attitude in keeping with the times, at least among hearing people, or was his view on the preference for oralism an outlier even at that time?
His preference for oralism was not an outlier by any means. And I think the complexity of this particular book about Graham Bell is that he's held in some ways to standards that were still relatively obscure in his day. Disability and the disability rights movement have come after the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and all kinds of other rights movements, none of which had really begun to rear its head at the time that Graham Bell was working. If you were disabled, there were less pleasant words than disabled to be used for it, and it was considered nothing but a misfortune.
I was going to ask, to what extent presentism, that is, viewing events and people in the past through the lens of contemporary moral standards, at work in this biography. There's a line in your review in which, in speaking of the author, Katie Booth, you say Booth's anger reflects a current trend of holding people from the past to standards of the present. I'm taking it you saw that as infiltrating this biography.
I did see it as infiltrating the biography and as being problematical. I think that at one point in the introduction to the book, Katie Booth compares Graham Bell to Hitler, and Graham Bell's intentions were good. He wanted to help people. He was, it's very clear as you read the biography, a good and generous person who really thought that he was going to help the beleaguered. Now, we may think from the perspective of today that the way he set out to do that was misguided and that what he did was not ultimately helpful to the community he wished to support. But there's no question that he set out to be someone who saved people from the terrible, what he saw, fate and peril of being completely marginalized. And I think that the flaw in this, in many ways, very good biography is that it feels somewhat agenda-driven, and it's driven by an agenda which is anachronistic in relation to what Graham Bell, when he lived, and the standards of his time.
I mean, another thing that was clearly not of today, but perhaps more reflective of the standards of his time, is that he was opposed to deaf intermarriage. And Helen Keller sided with him on this. Was this also mainstream at that time? And did either of them change their mind on this?
Bell certainly didn't change his mind on this. He was very much opposed to deaf people marrying one another on grounds that they would breed with each other and produce a deaf variety of the human race, which he saw as a disaster not only for the people who were members of that subculture, but also for the rest of society. He would have liked to eliminate deafness from the world, and there was not going to be any means of eliminating deafness if he saw deaf people marrying one another, producing children, bringing them up in a deaf context, and producing more deaf children. He didn't actually support, as he has sometimes been accused of doing, though not in this biography, he didn't support sterilization of deaf people or even laws that prohibited them from marrying one another. Of course, this was in an era when miscegenation laws were very much in place, and white people weren't supposed to marry black people, and certainly gay people couldn't marry one another, and restrictions on who could marry whom were very much present in the larger community. But his views were associated with the eugenics movement and contained some elements of eugenics. And Helen Keller certainly agreed with him initially. I think she ultimately changed her point of view, but the biography is of Bell rather than of Keller, so I don't know the exact details of when and how it happened.
It's not exactly a straightforward biography. You alluded to this earlier, but Katie Booth has a larger argument that she's trying to make. What exactly is that argument?
She is really trying to redress the inaccuracy of our perception of Alexander Graham Bell. You mention his name, and everyone says, oh, the guy who invented the telephone, and they take it from there. I mean, he defended his patents on the telephone incredibly vigorously because they came under question. And Booth does say that it's not entirely clear that he was really the progenitor of the phone, though his patents were ultimately sustained. But in any event, we think about him in terms of his scientific accomplishments, and there have been many very admiring biographies. This biography does its very best. It tries as hard as it can to be balanced about him, but the underlying anger that Booth feels about a man who she feels was responsible for the suffering of her deaf grandparents and for deaf family members going further back is evident and is apparent. And I think it's a book that is best read in combination with other information about Alexander Graham Bell as something that attempts to redress an imbalance rather than as the whole story simply unto itself.
I would like to talk a little bit about your own research that you did as part of Far from the Tree, where you had a chapter devoted to deaf children of hearing parents. And you mentioned earlier cochlear implants. Can you explain what those are and what you found in your research on this issue?
The cochlear implant is a device implanted under the skin of the skull and connected to a transmitter. It allows sound information to bypass the structures of the ear and go directly to the sound centers of the brain. For many people, it ends up producing a sufficient facsimile of hearing so that those people are able to function in the hearing world. It doesn't work for people whose hearing loss is not based in the ear, but in the brain itself, or certain other more obscure kinds of deafness. But most people who are deaf because of problems of the hair cells of the ear, and it does bypass those. It does not give people, as somebody put it, much access to music. It gives them adequate access to speech. For some people, it seems to work almost entirely. Other people spend years doing complex training to master the kind of information that it conveys. But what it means is that most deaf children who are born to hearing parents in the United States today are given a cochlear implant. And with that cochlear implant, an attempt is made to integrate them into the regular society so that they can function there. And while some people reject their implants, most children who are born deaf to hearing parents, and most deaf children are born to hearing parents, most of those deaf children do not engage with deaf culture.
And this has become controversial among deaf people because of its implications for deaf culture.
Exactly. And when I started doing my research on the deaf, I had not understood the power or the magnificence of deaf culture and of a society organized around the use of signed language. And I was kind of shocked by the idea that there was a cure for deafness and deaf people were angry about it. I thought surely people who had a disability were longing to have something that allowed them not to be limited by that disability. And then I went to deaf theater and I went to deaf households where the pets knew sign language. And I met a lot of deaf people and I thought, okay, every subculture can look like an illness from outside and then it can emerge as an identity. Now, I have to say, I think it's an advantage to be able to function in the larger world. And if I myself had a deaf child, I would be inclined to get that child cochlear implants so that he or she could function well in the world around. But I would also want to teach that child sign language and say, if the cochlear implant thing doesn't work for you, there's this other society you have access to. You could always turn it off and be part of that. And the problem with the implant, I think, is not so much the ability it gives people who are born deaf to function in the hearing world. That, I think, is terrific. It's its erasure of the deaf world, which can be a tragedy, both because the loss of any given culture is a tragedy, and because there are many people who always feel like, well, I have this weird thing that's implanted in my head, and I have to use the transmitter, and I can't do this, and I can't do that, and it only works as well as this, and my voice still sounds peculiar to people, and who never feel they quite fit into either world. And that can be a tragedy for people.
This brings up interesting questions around parallel situations or not. And two that I think of because you address them personally in your own work are gayness and also dyslexia, right? Dyslexia, not gayness in this case, but dyslexia can be considered a disability and it is treatable and you can then become someone who is able to read, I'm assuming fluently, although perhaps with some difficulty. And I'm curious if you think there's any kind of parallel here and sort of at what point the analogies don't work.
I think that every form of human difference is part of human diversity, and that any time you erase any kind of difference, there is loss involved in it. Now, I have dyslexia, and I have largely found ways around it. I don't know whether I would be a different writer or a different person without it, but I would say it essentially has been a nuisance. I still read very slowly. I have to type everything because if I write things by hand, the letters come out in the wrong order. I have a lot of challenges that I face that are connected to it, and in my life, those have been a nuisance. I'm also gay, and I know that if there had been something equivalent to the cochlear implant that my parents could have done so that I wouldn't be gay, they would have done it, and they would have done it not because they were violently homophobic, but because they would have perceived accurately in some ways that life is harder for gay people. And yet I feel that the struggles with identity that I faced as a gay person are what made me who I am, led me to the things I write about, and ultimately put me in the marriage that I'm in, which is joyful, with the children I have whom I adore. So at this stage of life, I certainly wouldn't go back and change that. But there was a stage when I was, in junior high, when I would have given almost anything to be straight and normal like everyone else, the way kids in junior high would like to do. I think what we need is to be awake to the fact that when we erase any kind of difference or disability, there is loss involved, and to assess what that loss is and not to pretend that all of what we do is simply progress toward a better world. And I think we have to recognize that the diversity of human experience makes the race a richer race and gives us more vitality in the same way that the variety of the ecosystem in the world represents a broader safety net in the face of climate catastrophe, for example. So it's not particularly that I think deaf people or gay people or dyslexic people are going to save the planet. But I do think as we look at eliminating kinds of difference, that there are dangers involved in it, even for differences that may on an individual level warrant changing because they cause individual people significant suffering.
Oh, Andrew, if only every writer acknowledged the complexity that you do with such nuance and thoughtfulness and compassion, we would all be in a better place. Maybe we would even solve climate change. I'm going to end there. Andrew, thank you so much for being here again. And hopefully you'll be back with Who Rocks the Cradle.
What a pleasure. Talk to you soon.
In this week's book review, Andrew Solomon reviews The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power, and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness by Katie Booth. Elizabeth Harris joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. The Trump administration is over. So Trump administration officials are shopping their books. And this is, a totally standard thing. They come out, some do well, some don't. Everyone moves on with their life. But now there's this incredible pressure on publishers from all sides about this. Simon & Schuster recently signed Mike Pence to a 2-book deal. And a significant number of their staff was extremely upset about this. And they circulated a petition that was signed by 200 people at the company, 3,500 people outside the company, including some big-name authors like Jessamine Ward and Saeed Jones. And they wanted the publisher to end the Pence book deal and say they wouldn't sign anyone else from the Trump administration. But Jonathan Karp, the CEO of Simon & Schuster, said no. And there are two main reasons for this. One is that conservative books are a big business. There are a lot of people who want to buy them, and some of them sell extremely well. And the other is what many in publishing see as like a moral imperative to publish a diverse array of voices. They're gatekeepers of debate, and they see it as important to the health of the country to get books out there from diverse perspectives, that this is a core part of their mission. But that's become complicated too. A lot of publishers are eager to show they're willing to work with politicians they consider somewhere in the mainstream, like Bill Barr and Mike Pence. But a lot of publishers have decided They won't work with any officials who pushed to overturn the results of the presidential election after President Trump had exhausted his legal avenues for disputing it. And in January, Simon Schuster canceled a book deal with Senator Josh Hawley, who was a prominent Trump supporter and was a big Stop the Steal booster, and was blamed for helping to incite the January 6th riot at the Capitol. But when he signed with another publisher, a small conservative publisher called Regnery, Simon Schuster said it would still distribute the book. But then this month, the publisher did something it says it has never done before and refused even to distribute a book that was being published by somebody else. This one was written by Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly, who is one of the officers who shot Breonna Taylor. So publishers are trying to figure out where the line is for themselves from a leadership perspective. At the same time, their staff is pushing in one direction, and there's a lot of money on the table. So there's a lot going on.
So this letter of protest from Simon & Schuster employees and authors and from others in the larger reading and literary world, that followed the signing of the book deal by Mike Pence. In your story, together with Alexander Alter this week, you revealed that Kellyanne Conway also has a book deal with Simon & Schuster. Have we heard anything since then? Has there been any noise on social media or any reaction from Simon & Schuster?
I haven't heard anything official, but on Twitter, it's absolutely blown up. I mean, she was trending yesterday, I believe, with Simon & Schuster, and there's all kinds of outrage. This is why this is such a contentious issue. I mean, there are so many people who are so angry about this on social media. And then there were people who were angry that people were angry and felt that she should be published and that it's censorship to shut these books down. And, it's just gone back and forth. And the temperature is so incredibly high. So it's really putting the publishers in a very difficult position.
All right. Well, surely we will discuss it again. Liz, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Cools and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
How are things?
Good.
Except you're reading a book called Despair, John.
I am. Well, I finished it recently, so I'm past Despair. It's a novel by Nabokov called Despair that I picked up, I think, randomly because someone on Twitter had mentioned it. And if I had heard of it, it was only vaguely. And what they were saying about it was convincing that it was entertaining. Even though it's called Despair, I think it's a funny book. It's fairly short. It was written in the 1930s, and he translated it himself into English soon after, and then I think he retranslated it in the 60s.
Show off.
And it's about a guy named Herman, or Herman, who finds, while wandering around town one day, what seems to be a homeless man sleeping on the ground, and he thinks that he looks exactly like him. So he wakes him up, and he talks to this guy, and he says, kind of tries to nudge him in the ribs, like, do you see what's going on here? And the guy is just totally oblivious to it and doesn't think they look anything alike. And eventually, Herman, who narrates the novel and is constantly making little asides to the reader, hatches a plan that's going to involve this double whose name is Felix, and it's going to be the perfect crime in his mind. What is funny about the book is not just the narrator's voice. It's wry, but you can tell that he's full of himself, but that he's not all that he thinks he is. And so there's this funny kind of put upon grandiosity that you can see through. And it's supposed to be, I think, a parody of sorts of a Dostoevsky novel like Crime and Punishment or Notes from Underground, because I think Nabokov was not a fan of those books. And so how and when it goes awry, I won't spoil, but it's really just about the voice of this character and the absurdity of some of the things he's planning and how they do or don't come off, and whether he or the double is really the doofus here.
Wait, so it's a parody of not of The Double by Dostoevsky, but of other Dostoevsky?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't know that there aren't elements of that. Obviously, there are. I mean, there's a backdrop element of that. I think it's more broadly speaking a parody of that kind of self-serious existential tale of someone committing a crime for reasons that are not always totally clear. It's weird to say that it's delightful, but it is. It's also goofy. I mean, I can see how it is probably not considered a major novel of his. There are moments, especially in the second half, when he starts bringing his wife into the plan and describing it to her and trying to convince her to go along with it, that are, to say they stretch credulity even in a satire is fair to say, I think. But he's just, who writes better than him? I mean, it's hard to name anyone. So I really enjoyed it. And might start a JAG soon. I haven't read him in a long time, so I might pick
Stay
up another
tuned.
one or two. Stay tuned. What about you, Greg? What are you reading?
Well, it's funny you talk about his funny put upon grandiosity because I'm reading A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley. This is autobiographical fiction, what we would call autofiction these days, published in 1968, a novel about an alcoholic school teacher who's obsessed with the New York Giants football team, and especially their star halfback, Frank Gifford, who went to USC with the narrator, and the narrator's kind of always measuring himself against Gifford's accomplishments and coming up short. But it's narrated in the first person with this very grandiose tone in a way that makes me think a little bit of Frank Bascom from The Sports Writer, that Richard Ford trilogy of Frank Bascom books, or Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, men who live in their minds more than through action and take issue with modern society and the expectations that it puts on men and masculinity. Maybe the book that it makes me think of most recently is a book that you reviewed for us, John, called The Throwback Special by Chris Batchelor, which, Pamela, I think you also liked a lot.
Yeah, John getting me to read a football novel. It's really great.
I still have that on my resume.
That book, too, obviously deals with football and masculinity and in fact, the New York Giants. But this one is maybe bleaker than any of those. The narrator, who's also named Exley, like the author, is existential to the point of nihilism. The book opens with him wanting to drink himself to death, envisioning putting a shotgun in his mouth and just blowing his head off. His wife has recently left him and taken their young twins with her. He's given up on everything, and football is kind of the last strand of hope. He hangs out at this bar above his local hometown and kind of sits up there on the hill looking down on everyone in society. So it's bleak, but bleak to the point of comedy. It's written in this truly eloquent, great voice that you just kind of laugh at his total despair with everything. And he clings to football knowing that he's clinging to it the way some people cling to religion or literature. He clings to football for its solace, but also it just makes him despair that he can't measure up.
It's funny you mentioned the Frank Bascom books because I think I read A Fan's Notes soon after I started reading those because I must have seen someone put them in a same barrel. And I remember liking it a lot, but it's been a long time now. The humor is definitely different in that book. It's not as light as some of the moments in Ford's books.
It's quite dark. There are times, not just nihilistic, but he can be monstrous in his views of other people, especially women, in a way that makes him hard to stomach. Sometimes he talks about violence against women. He imagines violence against women and sexual violence and just physical violence.
Yeah, and alcohol is very much at the core. It's sort of like if Richard Ford's Frank Bascom and The Lost Weekend were combined.
Yes, exactly right.
Pamela, do you have anything to lift our spirits?
No.
No.
No. I'm going to go with bleak and not entirely funny. One of these books has a sense of humor. I'm going to talk about two different books that I recently read, and you're going to be like, why would you talk about those together? But they do have something in common. So the two books are Lionel Shriver's novel from 2010, which is a National Book Award finalist, So Much for That, and Mbolo Mabue's How Beautiful We Were. And that book came out this year, and Mbolo was a guest on the podcast maybe a couple months ago talking about it. So what they have in common is that these are both books of ideas and incredibly ambitious in that regard. And the ideas are very different. So I'll talk a little bit first about Lionel Shriver. I really appreciated this book a lot. I can't say I loved it in the way that I loved Mbolo Mabue's, in that it's a little bit grueling to read, but that's because the subject matter is grueling. What she is taking on in this book is the American healthcare system. I had never read Lionel Shriver, and I think I've mentioned I'm probably the only person I know who didn't read We Need to Talk About Kevin. I was just like, yeah, I've seen the movie. So I didn't read the book. And when people talk about Lionel Shriver's novels, they often talk about them like, oh, that's the obesity one, or that's the healthcare system one, because she does kind of take on some big, meaty issue with each book. And this one is about a character named Shep Knacker, who is a handyman, basically, who starts his own company and is always scraping away to save money for what he calls the afterlife, which is going to be him leaving his workaday life ideally with his wife and kids, and moving to some country where he won't have to deal with any kind of bureaucracy or forms or just daily hassles of life. And at the opening of the novel, he's finally settled on the island of Pemba off the coast of Africa. And he goes to let his wife know, I've got the tickets. We're either all going or I'm going alone. And she informs him that she has a rare kind of cancer. And so much for that, as the title goes. And it's about dealing with illness and long-term illness. And there are 3 characters who are very ill in this book. Actually, there end up being 4, a surprise ill character, and in very different ways, and what that's like for people in this country. But Lionel Shriver, she's got such a distinct voice, and it's not that she's not compassionate for her characters, because she is, but her characters are often remorseless people. So I just want to read a tiny bit. This is Jackson, who is this extremely angry best friend of Shep Nacker and his coworker, who's always railing about what's wrong with this country. He has one big theory that everyone is divided into 2 groups, the mugs and the mooches, and what's terrible about each. And he's basically a mug. This is about midway through the book. Jackson hated the word inappropriate, which rot up the ass prisses threw around with abandon these days to make other people feel dirty and ashamed. It made you immediately want to check your underwear for stains. The word had a deliberate vagueness, too, as if what you'd done wrong was too disgusting to name, and it attributed moral qualities to the merely normative. The incessant modern-day resort to inappropriate put a thin, progressive gloss on what was really a regressive conformism. The folks who wielded that childing adjective were the same buttoned-up paranoids who spotted pedophiles under every bush, since lately you could be as uptight and sexually repressive as you liked, as long as you projected your prudish Victorian revulsion unto children. He was no more pleased than his own wife had picked up the term than he would have been had she returned from a public pool with communicable plantar warts. So you can just see there's a kind of refreshing meanness to it. It can be funny, but it's not the kind of book that you dive into at night feeling like, here's a nice pre-bedtime read. That said, I think there's a reason why people are drawn to Lionel Shriver's writing. It's so distinctive. I don't think a lot of people write like this.
I've not read Lionel Shriver before, but that passage that you just read makes me think of Zoe Heller, who has a similar tartness.
Yes. Zoe Heller, I have her in a little micro grouping in my head as the mean British writers, like the mean British women, but in a good way. I love her writing. But yes, she does remind me of Lionel. So the second novel that I read was How Beautiful We Were by Mbwela Mabue. And I'm kind of in love with this book. It's one of those books that I feel like everyone should read this book. And when people are asking me, what should I read right now? I just answer with this title, and then I come up with a reason why that specific person should read the book. I'm like, you love books about X, or you just find
like
a
words on
convenient
pages.
reason. That's right. But it's a story, as regular listeners will know, about a fictional African village in a country that goes unnamed, but might be similar to Cameroon, which is where the author is from. And it's a story of environmental degradation and what happens to a village that is a side effect of an American oil company's operations in Africa. It reminded me of this nonfiction book, which I think I mentioned recently on the podcast, by Michaela Wrong, called I Didn't Do It For You, which is about Eritrea. And that title is so affecting because essentially it reflects an American or Western or imperialist attitude towards many African countries, which is to say, like, it wasn't about you. It was about us. You just were there, it was just, we didn't pay attention. It wasn't our priority. And that's kind of what happens to this village in this country, but looking at it from the perspective of the villagers whose lives are, of course, devastated. And many people lose their lives because the environmental effects of the oil company's pipeline are brutal. And what I loved about this book was everything. But one of the things I really loved about it is that it is completely non-Western in perspective. in that the political alignments and considerations are very much of the time and place. It starts in 1980 and goes through today. And while there is a character who goes off to college to the United States and is informed by that experience, it's viewed as America is this other place where she goes and she learns these things that she then brings home. And it's not the center of the story.
I also recently read this book and loved it. She signs all of her letters home, "I am still one of you."
Yes. Yeah.
It's just kind of a lovely touch there.
I get goosebumpy. I don't know about you, Greg. I was just so moved by this story. It is incredibly immersive. And this was a book that, even though it's very sad, this is not an uplifting tale. I did want to turn to it at night because I was so immersed in the world that she creates in this book that I wanted to go back in.
It's a book that for the first maybe 50 pages is very focused on that 1980 period and kind of establishing its place and its village. But then it cracks open and it jumps forward a decade or so. And you get just this enormous scope. And it's a story of political awakening. And yes, this one character goes off to the West. But what she learns there, she brings back to the village. And it becomes a much bigger book.
Have you read it, John?
No, but you and others have spoken very convincingly of it, so it's on my pile.
John, are you looking for something to read? Let me tell you about this book. It's perfect for you.
You like words on a page.
That's right. People who love Nabokov also love Mbola Babue. All right, let's run down the titles of what we read.
I read Despair by Nabokov.
I read A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley.
And I read So Much for That by Lionel Shriver and How Beautiful We Were by Mbola Babue. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.